Howdy, y'all. Yeah, no. Good morning, everyone. It is so good to see you again. Thank you for joining us for daily devotions through Redeeming Life Fellowship. It's great to have you here again. We're continuing through our Revive School reading plan. If you haven't found that and been following along, I encourage you to do so. The link for it should be in this video. And yeah, it's great to have all of us coming together, reading the Bible together, and grasping its message and hearing what God has to say to us. So today we're going to be continuing through Psalms 96 and 97. So if you have a Bible, you can open up to that. But before we dive in and meditate on the words of the Psalms, I want to take a moment to ask you, just plainly, what is worship? It's a thing that as Christians is oftentimes talked about. The details of what worship actually is are often not unpacked, so that we as Christians, as human beings made in the image of God, ever really reflect on what we're doing and what we're supposed to be doing when we say that we worship God. Because worship, on its surface, seems like something that's fairly simple, even something that we associate with lots of world religions. That you have this place of worship where you go and you do your religious duty, and that's your act of worship. And the biblical understanding of what worship actually is, as we would see in something like the Psalms, is much wider, much deeper, much more intense, much more penetrating and life-changing than just those narrow descriptions or understandings about what worship is. So just if you need to, go ahead and pause the video and just think about it. What do you think worship is? And then we'll dive into the Psalms, and I'll get some more coffee. So, unfortunately, even for such a simple question as what is worship, I have yet, throughout my entire Christian life, found an adequate, short, and simple answer to it. Because if we're dealing with the question, who or what is it that we worship, we're talking about who or what is the object of our highest affections, our highest priorities, the center point around which all of our life revolves. And I think that when it comes to not just the question of what is worship, because we all worship lots of different things. It may be God, it may be other things. For my money, the best summary of what we might call true worship or Christian worship came from the pen of a former Archbishop of Canterbury named William Temple. And he described worship like this. To worship is to quicken the conscience by the holiness of God, to feed your mind on the truth of God, to purge your imagination by the beauty of God, to open your heart to the love of God, and to devote your will to the purposes of God. Now that's a pretty wide and expansive way of understanding worship. But what I think William Temple got right is the way in which true worship, whatever it happens to be, is the sort of thing that takes all of you. That that whatever it is that we worship, that's at the centermost point, or even you could say the highest point of your affections, that worship is the thing that takes all of you. I remember one of the things that I remember listening to the Presbyterian preacher Tim Keller, where what he described is like, how do you know what it is that you worship? How do you get a clear image or idea about what it is that you worship? And he posed the question, what is the thing that's in your life that if it was suddenly taken away, that you would almost lose the will to live? It's the thing that determines not just the substance of your dreams, but the substance of your nightmares. That if this one thing was snatched away, your whole life would be thrown out of order, out of orbit. You wouldn't actually have your bearings on life or reality or purpose or meaning. That is, whatever that is, that's the thing that you worship. Whatever that thing is in my life, that's the thing that I worship. And what I see clearly within the Psalms 96 and 97 is this, not just the psalmist expressing his worship towards the living God, but in the middle of both of the Psalms are mentions of idols who contest the worthiness of God for the psalmist to offer his worship to them. And I can relate to that because in your life and mine, there are always going to be idols, things in our lives that clamor for our utmost attention and affection and value and purpose and meaning, that say that want not just bits of us, but want all of us. And if there's anything that consumes us, that takes us, that takes all of us, that isn't God, that's an idol. And idols will eat us alive. They're things, they're created things, but if we offer our lives to them, idols will eat us alive. Idols will break our hearts. But it's God, when we make Him and Him alone the object and the center of our highest affections, that's when we find our conscience quickened, our imaginations purged, when we find our minds truly nourished on the truth of God, when our hearts are made alive by the love of God, and we actually find our true purpose for meaning, because we're the people who God has created. And if we can never get in touch and orient our lives around the will of God, we won't have ever understood what it is that we were made for. So that's just a snippet of what we're talking about when we're talking about the purposes of worship, and what is worship, answering that question. But these are some of the thoughts that I want you to think about as we're reading through Psalms 96 and 97. Is the picture of what worship is expressed or enlightened or writ large on Psalms 96 and 97? Go ahead, pause, read those verses, and read those chapters, rather, those Psalms, and then let's look at them together. So go ahead. So I'm sure that you can see here that what is happening in these Psalms of praise is the psalmist who's who's responding to what God has done and who he is, that he beckons us to sing a new song to the Lord, all the earth, to declare his glory because he is great. I love also that that you can notice in verses 7 through 9, where what the psalmist draws out is not simply that that God is great and that he's holy and that we need to magnify. It is a good thing for us to magnify the glory and the majesty and the power and the love of God. But what is it that we offer God in response to this? Ascribe to the Lord, O families of nations. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord glory due his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth. I see at least two things in there. One of them, that it's a good and right thing in response to the sheer majesty and power of God to tremble, to melt, as it were, as we see in Psalms 97, before the majesty and the glory of God. That's certainly, historically, one aspect in which the Quakers got right. So if you're looking at the Quaker oatmeal, and you could think about that guy doing this before, God and his holiness. So it's a little weird image, but we can unpack that history later. Anyway, but think about what it means to ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name, bring an offering, and come to his courts. What at bottom that tells me is not that simply that the psalmist is just admiring the glory of God and his majesty from afar, but that he recognizes that this is the sort of God who invites him into abiding fellowship with the living God. And that true worship, I don't think, not certainly in true Christian worship, can ever be divorced from abiding fellowship with the living God. To put it another way, and this comes through certainly in John chapter 4, that God seeks worshipers. He makes the initiative to seek out us. Worship is our response, or opening our hearts and our lives to walking in abiding fellowship with God, so that once we come into connection with the living God, and God begins and continues his work on our hearts, and we respond to God with praise and glory, that's worship. And we see it happening here with the psalmist, because clearly the psalmist isn't just saying nice things about God. His life and his heart is being changed by walking in intimate fellowship with the living God. And that's the sort of person that I want to be. That's the sort of person I want you to be, to experience the life-changing power of God by walking with him. And that the fruits of that's worship. And when we come together and sing songs to God, that should be, if it's true worship, the fruit of walking in abiding fellowship with God, who sought us out, who opened the door and called our name and drew us into his presence and says, come, walk with me. That's when we take that call of God upon our lives seriously, everything that births out of it is worship. So it's my encouragement to you to allow God to work on your heart and your life, to touch the innermost part of your being, that we would allow, in the words of William Temple, God to quicken our conscience by his holiness, that we would choose to feed our minds on his truth, that our imaginations, the things that we meditate on, that those things will be purged of everything that's unclean by the beauty of God. That our hearts, our calloused and hardened hearts, would finally be open to the love of God. And that our will, would be actually devoted, centered, anchored on the purposes of God. Because you may not know it, but God has a purpose for you. And it's our choice whether or not we want to devote our wills to that purpose. And let me tell you, there is no purpose that is so sure and no purpose so satisfying than what God's will is for you. We'll unpack that at length, I'm sure, at other times. But it's been a delight for you to come into my study, and that we can study God's word together and draw nearer to God, because that's the fruit, that's the purpose of why we study God's word together. So I do hope that you get to come to our Sunday or Wednesday services, that we can do this in fellowship, and it's just a wonderful, it's such a privilege to be here with you all, and I can hardly wait for the next time that we get to meet together again. So love you guys. I'll talk to you later.